This one's just a quickie. It actually took me a week to record this, basically because I was in a hospital in a Starbucks recording at the Wi-Fi network. It was a bit iffy. But what fundamentally people have strong opinions on what tech stack, or you come to somewhere and you're used to doing things one way and people are scared to change. So this is just to show you, don't be scared to switch your tech stack, have fun, play about, and then when we get to become serious, it makes sense to use the same component everywhere just to make things easier to support, but don't worry about it, it's easy. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a tech stack, and it was VirtualBox be coming out for Apple Silicon that got me all excited. So a long time ago, I did a lot of work with Sun Microsystems, who got bought over by Oracle, but VirtualBox was a Sun product. And VMware Fusion, which all my experiments have been done on so far on my Mac, is it's been bought over by someone who screws the license for everyone. So lots of people are moving away from it because people have taken money out of it. So in all my documentation, if you've got a PC or an Intel Mac or PC, use VirtualBox, and if you're an Apple Silicon, use VMware Fusion. But the good news is VirtualBox now recently supports Apple Silicon, so I would recommend just using VirtualBox, but we'll show we're running both. And then obviously you've got your Linux stack. So the whole point of this example is just to build a web server. So you've got Ubuntu Linux, which is the one I use for everything, and it's the one we'll probably stick to for the foreseeable future until we get to build production systems. Rocky Linux is from the Red Hat family, so there's Red Hat, CentOS, etc. And Alpine's a really tight, secure, minimal Linux. So we'll see if we can build with that. And then you've got the Docker products. You've got Docker, you've got Docker Compose, which is the orchestration for it. You've got Podman, which is there's no license implications. Podman's open source, and we've got Containerd that does the same thing for Kubernetes. And of the web servers, Nginx is the typical web server someone pick nowadays. There's an Alpine Nginx version that's more memory efficient, smaller footprint. So we'll look at that. And then there's Apache HTTP server. There's the original one, still works well. We're gonna see if we can build a system that does a website using all of these various combinations of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the config file of an Apple Silicon Mac that we use. iTerm as the terminal, VirtualBox as the provider, and Vagrant as the infrastructure as code tool. And what these components are going to build, they're going to build an Ubuntu Linux with Docker installed, Docker Compose installed. We put on the compose.yaml, we make the index.html file for a website, and we use an Nginx container to actually be the website. And if you do it in Raspberry Pi, you do it without the virtualization layer. So it's just Ubuntu, Docker, Docker Compose, and the same components. So don't be scared to have a play either on a virtual machine, which is really easy, or within a Raspberry Pi or an old PC, whatever we're using. So on my M1 MacBook here, I installed VirtualBox. So you just go to the VirtualBox websites on the left hand side. We installed the Vagrant itself, and we installed the Vagrant VMware utility. Actually, I've got muddled up as we need all three components. And I used these commands because I was switching from my Vagrant plugin underneath from VMware Fusion to Vagrant. But if you do a clean install, you don't need it. But the Vagrant plugin, expunge, reinstall, just reinstalled the plugin and updated the plugin. So the Vagrant up command is the command to bring up your entire environment. Vagrant SSH if you want to jump inside it. We don't need to do that. And Vagrant destroy -f means once you finish with it, it wipes everything. So you get a nice clean install, because I only run one environment at a time and I wipe it all the time. So the Vagrant configuration file is the only file we're going to use. and it's going to be a mixture of bash and vagrant. So you can see there's some bash inside it where you see the sudo apt update firewall disable. So that's the bash components, and the rest of it's a vagrant configuration file. So it's what HashiCorp use for most of their stuff. So let's have a closer look at this file. So this is the key to the provider and the operating system. So it says the configuration bend to Ubuntu 24. So that's Ubuntu 24. So that's going to be the operating system. And the provider is VirtualBox. So we're going to use VirtualBox to bring up an Ubuntu virtual machine. And the memory and CPU tells us is a 4 gig machine, 4 gig of RAM, two virtual CPUs. The commands below, you probably don't need that much. So the VM synced folder is disabled. So by default, the system wants you to share some of your Mac files with your home folder, but we just separate it because we use the environments to trash. The network, I'm given the IP on my own network, 192.168.1.253. Your own network at home, it might be a 0 instead of a 1. But there's the other videos we've done on YouTube will show you all the documentation. But it's quite simple, and then shell runs the Unix commands as we were building the machine. So the Docker compose file that gets written within this file. So it says we're going to make a container. We're just going to fetch the Nginx container. We're going to run it on port 8080. The container itself on 80, and it's going to grab the index.html from the folder on the virtual machine, which is home vagrant HTML. So we just create the index file, index.html, and below the HTML5 logo, the index.html is just text for hello world. It is valid HTML, but it's probably the simplest HTML page you could ever get. It doesn't have paragraphs or headers or any of the sensible things. It's just so we can test this. So this is the bash that if you're not using a virtual machine to do this, you can just run these commands with inside your Raspberry Pi or your old PC. So sudo update, it just updates the packages. If you were going to run it forever, the line that's commented out was you would do all the patching, but because most of my environments only last an hour, I don't bother. So sudo UFW disable, that turns off the firewall. The next two lines turn off AppArmor. So it's just so they don't get in the way of our experiment. The next two lines, the swap and the swap off and the sed, they just mean if the virtual machine runs out of memory, just crash down rather than try and page and stuff like that. And then we've got a Docker install. So we group add Docker, just follow the instructions, creates a user. So the group add and the user mod mean you can type a Docker command rather than type in sudo docker, so you don't have to go up to root. And the next line is Docker IOs, install Docker. The slurp 4 it's a network thing that Docker requires. And then we've got installing Docker compose. And the final line, the gap, is at the end line, which is it just brings it up, the Docker image. So if we run that file in its entirety, we get a web page on 192.168.1.256:8080 or port 8080, and it just replies to the web page that says hello world. So that's on the browser, and then the bottom is, if you do it from command line, curl's a command line browser so that you can see consistently everything works, and it's good for testing. Curl's handy. So the whole purpose of this, whatever combination of Linux and Docker and web server we use, we're going to produce this website, and this curl command is going to work as well. So we've got two machines, and the difference is one is running VMware Fusion and one is running VirtualBox. And the only line that changes in the infrastructure as code is the config VM provider. So one's VMware Fusion and one's VirtualBox. So it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, you've got to install the VirtualBox and the Vagrant plugins on one system, and you've got to have VMware Fusion on the other. VMware Fusion does need a license number. It's free for playing about, but VirtualBox doesn't. So if you haven't started your journey with VMware Fusion, don't bother. Just start it with VirtualBox, and life's going to be easy because we're just using open source and everything's good. Okay, so this time we're going to still have the Nginx web server, still going to have Ubuntu as the operating system, but we're going to switch to Podman rather than Docker. Docker has some license constraints and Podman has none. So if we look at the difference in the file, so you can see diff command shows you the difference between two things. So what we can see is in the top file, where we install Docker and the network and Docker compose, these lines are no longer needed, and we can just use apt-get install -y podman and podman compose. So it's even simpler to install. We're going from 4 or 5 lines down to 2. Now for the image, whereas previously we had Nginx, we have to actually clarify exactly where it is. So Docker defaults to looking in Docker IO /library for images. Because we're using Podman, it doesn't actually default to the Podman registry, so we just explicitly confine it. So all we do is we change from Nginx to we put docker.io /library/Nginx. And had we used that in the first one, it would still work as well when it was Docker. And then of course the line to boot it up instead of Docker compose, up -d, it's Podman compose up -d. So that's all we need, just a few lines to switch from Docker to Podman. Okay, now this time instead of Nginx, we're going to use Alpine Nginx, which is a web server it's a container image, but it's much tighter. It uses less resources and it's secure. So all we do is the one line we change is docker.io library Nginx. We use a different image, which is Nginx:1-Alpine. And as an aside on this diagram, so in Docker Hub, we've got 3 pictures from Docker Hub. Docker Hub is Docker.io. We can see that there's an Nginx image, Nginx Alpine image, and HTTPD image. So you can have a look at all these and just in detail if you want to look at the different container images and what's different between them all and the file sizes. It's all documented there. And then what ChainGuard, Red Hat's Key.io, and Platform One, which is the US Department of Defense, there are different repositories. So we don't have to default to docker.io, which is Docker Hub. We've got ChainGuard, which makes really good images, really small, but they are expensive for production, about 10 grand image. Red Hat, obviously owned by IBM. There's lots of images there. And Platform One, I think it's actually an Air Force URL, but it's for the so if you're building software for the US Department of Defense, rather than certify everything, if you use the certified images, you get a much easier job of getting into production. But it's just to show you there are different registries to get your images from rather than just Docker.io. Okay, this time we're switching to Apache rather than Nginx, which is the older website that everybody used. And if we look at the difference in command line, the image instead of is Docker.io and Nginx, it's HTTPD, and the home vagrant HTML directory is mounted in different locations within the container, even though it's just a one-page index.html, and that's because each of the web servers has got a different default location for the web server. But it's as simple as that. 2 lines lets you switch it from Nginx to HTTPD, so don't be scared about switching your web server over. As I was recording this in the hospital and Starbucks, I ran out of time to get a Rocky Linux image that was compatible with Apple Silicon Mac. Doesn't mean to say I couldn't do it, and I might still redo it. I had a look at Rocky Linux, I had a look at Fedora, and I had a look at CentOS. They're all the same, but it didn't work. But I'll come back to it in the next page. So the next Linux we tried to switch, we took Ubuntu out and used Alpine, and it worked. So what we do in the config box, instead of the Ubuntu 24, we've got an Alpine standard. So that changes that. And then when you look at the bash stuff, like instead of apt-get, it's apk. So it's apk, so it's just a different package manager. Had I got the Rocky Linux or the Red Hat one working, the package manager's DNF. So it's just there's just a few lines changed. So as you can see, adds Docker compose, does an update and starts. So if you do switch to Linux, you're going to have more commands to change. But when we get to production, we pick which Linux we want for production, then we'll narrow it down. But while we're in development, just develop everything in Ubuntu. It's easier. Everybody uses it for development. So don't be scared of the Linux. And then I've ran out of time, but K3S, I was going to add the video, but this video is long enough, so I'll do dedicated ones on Kubernetes. But Rancher make a Kubernetes deployment called K3S, and under the hood it uses Containerd rather than Podman or Docker. So it was just to show you it's just as easy to make, but we'll do that another day. So thank you very much, and I hope you found that interesting, or at least you're brave enough to have a play and don't worry too much about breaking things and trying. It's easy to restart and do it again. Thank you.